Well, Art O'Neill, I want to thank you for joining us, the Dean of the Republicans in the House. You are the longest-serving Republican, are you not, Art O'Neill?
That's right. I've been in the legislature since 1988.
Okay, well, a Purple Heart indeed for you. I've got to ask you, we had Brian Renstrom on just a couple of moments ago talking about the Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century with a lot of really good ideas about reforming the way the state does business. Do you guys ever, in the rank and file, though you are one of the leaders, do you ever really listen to these guys? Do you ever hear a lot from them? Do we ever seriously contemplate major reforms in informational technology, social services delivery, relationship between states and localities? They've got some big issues that they're putting before us, and they're telling us, like you are with this study of schools, that the demographics in the state of Connecticut are going to be working against a healthy, vibrant economy. And frankly, we got to really deal with some of these things because we are really being crushed, and we're going to be further crushed for a decade or more if we don't start dealing with these things.
Well, in fact, we do sometimes in the legislature. Certainly I do, and my Republican colleagues and I come forward with various proposals to try to change the way we do business in the state of Connecticut. And in fact, we had a proposed alternative budget that was balanced under the spending cap and managed to avoid raising taxes, but there was absolutely no consideration given to it. We have talked about regionalization, incentivizing communities to get together and work on things. Sometimes it's difficult. For example, we had to push legislation for the last few years that would allow towns like, say, Roxbury and Bridgewater, which wanted to share a resident state trooper. They were blocked by existing state statutes that weren't really intended to do that. It just sort of accidentally prevented them from sharing a state trooper. So we're always working on things to try to encourage this. This study that I'm proposing about regionalization is sort of part of that questioning of the way we do business and the overall approach we're taking, because if indeed there is a permanent reduction in the number of students that we're going to be seeing going to the school districts outside of the big cities, then that really may change the way we want to organize local education, perhaps the way we pay for local education, a whole host of things. Every school district looks at this from the standpoint of, we're experiencing a decline in student population because of something peculiar to this particular region or this particular school district. And it seems like it's all over the state of Connecticut. It's not just in Region 12 or Region 14 or Region 15, but all across northwestern Connecticut and apparently, as far as I can tell, across many other parts of Connecticut as well. So first we have to get the data. And, there are suggestions, for example, I've read stories about where a reporter, I'm not trying to take a shot at the reporter, but a reporter will say something like, because of the chronically low birth rates in Litchfield County, that's why the student populations are going down. Well, here's the thing. They would be staying stable if they were maintaining the same birth rates that we had 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. You're seeing a decline because, if it's birth rates, because of a decline in birth rates. Some people say, well, it's the Great Recession. That's a convenient thing to explain everything, is to say, well, the recession caused problems, caused people to put off starting families. And I'm sure that was a factor, but some of these trends go back prior to 2007 in terms of the decline of student population. This is not something that just started in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so Art, you want a study of this, a task force, to study the declining student enrollment. Now, it passed the House. What happened to it in the Senate?
Well, I think it basically just got lost in the crush of business up there at the very end. A lot of bills die in the Senate because we pass them in the House and then they get up on the calendar there, and they just don't get acted on because the Senate just collects all these bills and uses them as bargaining chips for things like the budget.
Now we see where Southbury and Woodbury may be getting together because of the increased cost of state troopers, maybe working together with their police forces. Are there going to be just variables that are going to require communities to get together in ways that they never considered? And is this one example? And what about even the state funding all these buildings to the tune of 70% or 80%, encouraging towns and cities to just build because you can do it on the back of the state? When do we make that a much more difficult process to get through based on a whole lot of, demographics and, empirical evidence that you need another building?
Well, I think that it is something that we really do need to address. I mean, we had a program of magnet schools that were designed to address the racial imbalance issues, specifically in Hartford, but more generally, these policies were applied to the state of Connecticut. And so every school that's been built for the last 10 or 15 years in the city of New Haven was designated as a magnet school, which meant that I think the entire cost of the school the construction was paid for by the state of Connecticut. So they have all brand new schools in New Haven. They're all designed to be magnet schools, and that question is, how much longer can we sustain this? Education spending for bonding, our bonding for public education, is the biggest chunk of our bonding package every year, and it has been for over a decade, maybe 15 or 20 years. Now, Connecticut is unusual. In many other states, and you hear this debate go on about we don't support education from the state, they'll talk about how in some other state, the state is providing 70% of the educational costs or the salaries for teachers or something like that. What they don't mention is that the locality is expected to pay the entire cost for building things. So we've got a somewhat different policy from what most of the rest of the country has, the theory being that we can issue the bonds more efficiently and at a lower rate of interest because we're a big organization, the state is, whereas municipalities would be rated at a higher rate by the rating agencies and pay higher interest and would have more transactional costs because they would be doing little bond issues to build stuff.
But at the very least, should we look for at the very least, should we look for a moratorium on building new schools until we have some better assessment as to, what the future student enrollments are going to look like? I mean, should we hold back for a while if it is a huge part? And we know that bonding, along with pension obligations, are a huge part of the drag that we have on our state budget. I mean, should we stop for a while and, get some information? I mean, that's what the city of Waterbury ultimately decided to do instead of building an East End school, was to stop and take an inventory of schools that we have, including now parochial schools that are not being utilized.
Well, I certainly think that study being done in Waterbury makes a lot of sense. One of the things that a demographic study would tell us, I think, is what the long-term needs are for education. And then a different study, and I know Sam would be upset about this, but we really do need to gather the information at the state level as to what all of the available public schools are in various regions of the state of Connecticut, so that we could say, you could probably move, if you could move 100 students from one school district to another, you could avoid, shutting down a school, which costs money and disrupts things, and also the other school, the sending school district, could avoid perhaps having to build a school or even just do an addition, so that we can make much more efficient use of the resources that we have. We could still maintain these jurisdictions because people really do like the idea of local government being truly local, and still, I think, find ways to take advantages of efficiencies and larger scale operations.
Well, how long, though? I mean, when I had Brian Renstrom on, from Bloom Shapiro and the 21st Century Institute, he's saying we're paying a real premium for all of the small towns that we have here in the state of Connecticut. He's saying if you add what the small towns and all of the towns are spending, the $20 billion state budget is equaled by what the towns are spending. And he said anytime you've got 300, he calls it, because you're, taking your education departments and then your regular municipal, and you couple them together, you've got about 300 agencies of government there. He's saying that we are just spending an awful lot for the parochialism that we like here in the state of Connecticut. What do you say about that?
Well, I think he's right. I mean, the very small units of government, which I grew up with and I'm familiar with because that's how I grew up in Connecticut, this is very different from the rest of the country. Although in other parts of the country, they will create little municipalities and cities and boroughs and village districts and stuff like that to get that small town kind of operation at the local level where there are enough people. But what amazes me is the number of people who come from, say, Ohio or California or Texas, and they move here and they find out that you can walk into the first selectman's office in Southbury, and the only thing between you and the first selectman is a very thin door. Whereas if you were in a county in Texas or someplace, you might have to drive 100 miles and go through 5 different levels of aides and secretaries and whatnot to get to see the top person. So people do like that instant access to the top local officials. But
at what expense? And
that becomes a question, because it does cost money to have units of government as small as the ones that we currently have. Now, I was one of the people, for example, that helped reorganize the probate court system. We passed legislation a few years ago. It took us from 117 probate courts down to about 56, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a major battle because people like to have the local probate court. They liked the local probate judge that really was friendly and so forth. And it's a struggle, but we achieved some fair amount of efficiencies by eliminating dozens and dozens of judges and consolidating operations and eliminated the need to have all the towns upgrade their facilities because you needed better facilities for a lot of the things that were being done. A lot of records are being stored in somebody's garage in some of the really small towns. So we can get there. The legislature doesn't really like to do this, only kind of pushes when it's pushed by financial realities that cannot be avoided.